Welcome, everyone. My name is Simon Kelly. I'm the curator of modern and contemporary art here at the St. Louis Art Museum. I'm very happy to welcome you here tonight. So each year in March, which is Women's History Month, the museum is honored to present the Mary Strauss Women in the Arts Endowed Lecture. This annual event has been made possible due to the vision, commitment, and generosity of Mary Strauss, who is here with us this evening. So please join me in thanking her for her support of the museum, its programming, and women in the arts. Thank you, Mary. This year, we wanted to have a lecture that would accompany the current Monet Mitchell Painting the French Landscape exhibition, and specifically focus on the life and work of the artist Joan Mitchell, whose spectacular paintings many of you will have seen in the current exhibition. So I'm very pleased to welcome our speaker tonight, Marion Salvetar, who is Assistant Curator of Painting and Sculpture at the San Francisco Museum of Modern Art. Marion has contributed to collection presentations and traveling exhibitions, including the Joan Mitchell Retrospective, which has run from 2021 to 2023, and I'm sure many of you have seen, and the exhibition Frank Bowling, The New York Years, 1966 to 1975, which is running from 2022 to 23. And she also wrote a very thoughtful and insightful essay on Joan Mitchell and her circle at Verneuil for the Paris catalogue of the Monet Mitchell exhibition. As you probably know, the show we have here is a different version of that exhibition that recently closed at the Fondation Louis Vuitton. So she's really the perfect person to speak here tonight. Marion recently co-organized After Images Echoes of the 1960s from the Fisher and SF MoMA collections, and Sadie Barnett Space Time for SF MoMA's Bay Area Walls series of artist commissions. She holds a PhD in art history from the University of Chicago and previously contributed to exhibitions at the Art Institute of Chicago, the Arts Club of Chicago, and the University of Chicago Smart Museum of Art. Marion's talk tonight is entitled Joan Mitchell's Views from Latour, Painting, Memory, and Landscape at Verneuil. So please welcome her to the stage. Thank you, Marion.
Hello, everybody. I hope you can hear me okay. Thank you so much for the warm introduction, Simon, and I'm really thrilled today to share a close look at some of the paintings on view in the exhibition, Monet Mitchell, Painting the French Landscape, in the galleries just a few 100 feet away. I want to extend a special thanks to Simon for the invitation and to Jessica Kennedy and Jason Gray for all of their help with the arrangements and planning for this talk. And of course, to Mary Strauss, who I had the pleasure of meeting just a minute ago, for her support for this series. I walked through the exhibition today, which is really stunning, and hope you've had a chance to see it as well. With such incredible works in the galleries nearby, I'm really pleased to talk to you today about Joan Mitchell and the importance of French landscape and 19th century artists, including Monet, Vincent van Gogh, and Paul Cézanne for her painting. So we can go ahead and begin. So in 1968, Joan Mitchell moved from Paris to Latour in Verneuil, France, a country estate near Giverny with lush gardens, a dedicated studio, and a small cottage where Claude Monet lived and worked from 1878 to 1881. She'd purchased Latour in 1967, which you see here at left in a photograph taken from the Seine River. In that first year, she visited the property on weekends with friends until she settled there in 1968, where she would remain until her death in 1992. The main house with a turret, which you can see on the hilltop in the photo at left, was surrounded by a rich landscape and elevated views of the nearby fields and Seine River below. These vistas were infused with the celebrated French light that flooded by paintings by 19th century painters, including Monet and Van Gogh, who Mitchell first discovered as a child at the Art Institute of Chicago. Mitchell was born in Chicago, where she had studied at the School of the Art Institute of Chicago before she became known as an abstract expressionist painter in New York and Paris in the 1950s and 1960s. While Mitchell traveled restlessly in the previous years, moving between New York and Paris, sailing the Mediterranean, and returning to visit her family in Chicago, Landscape references and her relationship to 19th century French painting blossomed in her decades in the countryside. As she noted near the end of her life, "I'm from another century, no doubt, from a time when they knew what it was to paint." Mitchell had long associated Paris, and France more broadly, with what she described in 1955 as, quote, "the life of a painter," defined by what she called continual working, where daily life centered around painting in the studio. Today, we will explore how Mitchell's work had long drawn from traditions of French modernism, rooted in her formative experiences at the Art Institute of Chicago, and long-time interest in flooding her abstract compositions with what she described as a feeling rooted in the full-bodied experiences and memories of landscape. As her circle dispersed beyond New York and Paris in the 1960s, Mitchell more openly claimed her landscape and its history in art as she began painting at Latour. She created a living dialogue by communing with her 19th century predecessors in increasingly direct ways. Latour helped fuel what one interviewer called a, quote, "marvelous expansion of Mitchell's work," as she painted increasingly large-scale abstract compositions that drew from the airy views, trees, and flowers of her property at Latour. Alongside these new visual experiences of landscape, Mitchell also recalled vivid memories of paintings and watery landscapes from Chicago, New York, and Paris. Drawing from the French countryside surrounding Latour and Vitoy, which she had first seen through paintings by Monet, Van Gogh, and others at the Art Institute, Mitchell looked back to propel her work forward in the final decades of her career. At Latour, Mitchell found a rich territory for her painting in the familiar vistas that she related to beloved 19th century paintings at the Art Institute that were rooted in the cultural history of Chicago and her own childhood. In a 1974 interview, Mitchell blended references to her surrounding landscape and memories of specific paintings. As she described, "I live in it, I walk in it, it's fabulous. The garden, the trees, the church, the fields behind where Monet did his poppy things, the Seine right below." A generation before Mitchell was born, in 1925, the Art Institute of Chicago and its early leaders, including founding trustee Martin Ryerson, who you can see here visiting Monet at Giverny, helped build a substantial collection of Impressionist and Post-Impressionist paintings at the Art Institute became central to the cultural identity of Chicago. Monet in particular was at the core of the collection. He held his first gallery exhibition in Chicago in 1888, which quickly ignited a passion among collectors, including Ryerson, Lewis and Larned Coburn, as well as Bertha and Potter Palmer, who came to own over 90 paintings by Monet, many of which joined the Art Institute's collections by the 1930s. As one critic remarked in 1888, "Why go to Paris, since Paris has come to Chicago?" The Art Institute held Monet's first American Museum solo exhibition in 1895 and became the first institution to acquire his work in 1903. This rich collection and its deep history of Impressionist and Post-Impressionist art was formative to Mitchell, who as a child spent weekend outings with her father at the galleries of the Art Institute and participated in the museum's Saturday art classes beginning in the second grade. While Mitchell first enrolled at Smith College, where she took art classes, her summers at Oxbow, the Art Institute of Chicago's summer school of painting in Saugatuck, Michigan, in 1943 and 44, encouraged her to transfer to the School of the Art Institute of Chicago. A 1944 brochure advertised Oxbow as, quote, "the country school of the Art Institute," where, quote, "along the river and the lake and in nearby farmlands are motifs for landscape." As seen here in a photograph with fellow classmate Dan Sparling, Oxbow offered uninterrupted time to paint freely, often outside in plein air, surrounded by the lush landscape. Parallel to her later descriptions of Latour, Mitchell recalled of Oxbow, quote, "I couldn't wait to get up to paint. I never felt like that before or since. It was everything." Spurred by her summers at the Art Institute, at Oxbow, in fall of 1944, Mitchell enrolled at the School of the Art Institute. The Art Institute School was founded on the model of the French Beaux-Arts Academy, with traditional training with classes including figure painting, figure drawing, and lithography. Mitchell later summarized the curriculum succinctly as, quote, "largely French, and art with a capital A was always French." One of the benefits of the school, as described in a 1945 course catalog, was its proximity to the museum's collection. As the brochure noted, Quote, in addition to the studios, students benefit from intimate contact with the splendid collections housed in the museum. Building on her childhood experiences at the museum, this deep familiarity with the Art Institute's collection would remain with Mitchell for decades, as she could recall in vivid detail specific works from memory. As Mitchell explained near the end of her life, in 1992, I learned in Chicago at the Art Institute when I was young. I had lessons in the basement under the halls of the museum, and in the galleries Seurat, Cézanne, Van Gogh, Lautrec, Monet. When I was a child, I thought all painting was French because of these names. At the SAIC, School of the Art Institute, formative instructors, including Louis Rittman, who himself was a painter of impressionist landscapes that glowed with light and color, often taught in the museum's galleries using the paintings that Mitchell knew intimately. Rittman had studied at the School of the Art Institute and the École des Beaux-Arts in Paris, and later spent time in Giverny between 1909 and 1929 to be near Monet. In this photograph of one of the figure painting classes Mitchell took with Rittman, we can see Mitchell here at the far left with her arms crossed, and Rittman at the lower right. The class is surrounded by the expressive figure paintings by fellow students. Rittman encouraged students, including Mitchell, to, as a fellow School of the Art Institute graduate painter Ed Clark described, keep painting. Mitchell would reference Rittman's early training and encouragement years later in interviews, and even recognized one of her teacher's paintings decades later in the attic of a friend at Giverny. As she described, they had a lot of impressionists who lived around there when Monet lived there. And they pulled out this painting, and I recognized the ways the hands were drawn, and it was a Louis Rittman. In her student years, under the guidance of Rittman and other teachers, Mitchell recalled, quote, I did 6 hours of life drawing a day and 3 hours of life painting. And on the weekends, I did my own still lifes and landscapes at home. Despite her training, Mitchell began moving away from figuration even in her student years, describing in a 1947 letter, painting is leaning abstractly in my mind. In 1947, Mitchell completed her studies at the Art Institute and received a coveted traveling fellowship to France. As she waited for conditions to improve in Europe after World War II, she first moved to New York in 1947 at the encouragement of teachers, including Rittman. She joined Barney Rosset, who would become her first husband, at an apartment below the Brooklyn Bridge before spending the following year in France. In these early years, she painted in a semi-abstract style that depicted still lifes and natural and urban landscapes from her time in Paris and the Lavandou in the south of France. In the fall of 1949, Mitchell left France and returned to New York. She quickly abandoned figuration for a more complete abstract style that instead allowed memories of what she called feelings of landscapes and places to drive her gestural compositions that she built up carefully and slowly over time. She settled in a studio at 60 St. Mark's Place, which you see photos of her in her studio at left, and quickly became a central figure among abstract expressionist peers in New York. Yet in a 1957 interview with critic Irving Sandler, she described herself as, quote, conservative, explaining, in my work, nature is important. In this way, I am impressionistic, but not the kind of light that they were involved with. I don't want to change nature. I want to catch my feelings about them. I want to express myself about my impressions. City Landscape, 1955, which the Art Institute of Chicago acquired in 1958, and you see here, at right, is one of the paintings, a group of paintings that Mitchell made with the same title. Framed by references to natural and urban settings, this composition shows the complex ways that Mitchell drew from her deep familiarity with French landscape traditions. She made paintings that were entirely her own, as she built up layers of marks, dripping lines, and swatches of color to create a vibrant, interwoven visual space. Here we see cloudy grays and textured whites around the edge of the composition that draw the eye to the central tangle of dense, bright gestural marks in an incredible range of colors. You can see pinks, oranges, yellows, blues, reds, and ochres that capture the energy of the city as seen from afar. As Mitchell explained in 1957, quote, I start with landscape ideas and merge them together, but I find what I'm after in the painting itself, in what I see. At once representational and abstract, this work blends references, memories, and visual experiences of cityscapes of Chicago, New York, and Paris. Just as the title blends references to urban and natural settings, Mitchell saw all of her experiences of different places as a territory for her paintings. As she had explained to Sandler, "Man made a city, nature grows. I see it all as nature. I look at it all as what I see." This became a touchstone work that seemed to look at once backwards and forwards, and Mitchell painted city landscape 1 year just before she began splitting her time between New York and Paris between 1955 and 1959. In this period, Mitchell's work thrived on her transatlantic movement as she distilled flowing impressions of lived experiences on both sides of the Atlantic into the fixed medium of paint. As she explained to Sandler in 1957, "Traveling around is a way of finding things which actually find me. I paint what makes me want to get up in the morning." In both Paris and New York, a resurgence of interest in Monet among critics and fellow artists led to terms such as abstract impressionism, coined by Mitchell's friend Elaine de Kooning. Critics grouped works by Mitchell and peers, including Sam Francis, who flooded abstract canvases with vibrant effects of light and space. In this period, many artists expressed their formal interest in Monet's late paintings that almost fully abandoned representational forms to capture optical effects of color and light. Yet beyond color and landscape, Mitchell drew from modernist predecessors in complex and often subtle ways to push her own work forward. The bridge, which you can see in the artist studio at left above Mitchell, where she's sitting, the two panels hanging above, in her Paris studio, was her first diptych, a multi-panel format that she wouldn't return to until the 1960s, but that would become central to her late paintings. With a relatively sparse composition of horizontal and diagonal lines that give a sense of movement across the two panels, the bridge referred at once to bridges Mitchell knew in Chicago, New York, and Paris. Yet this work also embodied for Mitchell the spanning sensations that these structures could evoke. She described, quote, "a feeling of space and freedom, space, structure, color. The diptych will be used not only in terms of remembered images, but remembered paintings." Whether referencing remembered paintings of her own or others, Mitchell would have intimately known two of Monet's paintings of the Waterloo Bridge and Charing Cross Bridge in London, both given to the Art Institute of Chicago as part of the Ryerson Collection in 1933. These works are among a series of nearly 100 paintings that Monet began during 3 trips to London between 1899 and 1901, before reworking many of them in Giverny until they were exhibited in 1904. On this trip, his paintings each focused on one of 3 subjects: the Waterloo or Charing Cross bridges seen from either side of his hotel room at the Savoy, and later the House of Parliament, often captured at different times of day with slight color and compositional variations. Mitchell would later insist in a 1973 interview that she was, quote, "not a series painter, but a subject painter," a distinction she would draw specifically between her work and Monet. Yet this diptych introduces a multi-panel format to create a sense of time and a fusion of grounded and aerial views to return to a subject that recurred in Mitchell's early work from her 1940 sketches of the Brooklyn Bridge and paintings with bridge titles. Significantly, as Simon Kelly has pointed out in his writings, Monet's name and even the subject of bridges were both notably absent when the bridge was reproduced in a 1958 Art News article, "Is Today's Artist with or Against the Past?" And you can see the page of the article here. Mitchell had made a passing reference to Monet from Sandler's notes in the interview, but for the article, the painting was paired, as we see here, with a snapshot of a 12th century basilica in Burgundy, France. Mitchell's interview cites Van Gogh, Matisse, Cézanne, and even Renoir, but not Monet. Instead, this visual comparison shows the ways Mitchell drew from what she called her valise of memories or suitcase of memories in her paintings. Bridges could reference her native Chicago, her first Brooklyn apartment, or what she called the low squat bridges of Paris. In 1948, she described walking the Seine in Paris, quote, "looking vainly for something that looked like the Brooklyn Bridge. The closest thing to the bridge is Notre Dame." This slippage between bridges and cathedrals resurfaced in the 1958 interview, as Mitchell explained, "I don't want to see a Romanesque cathedral every day. It's there like Rikers. I can't close my eyes or limit my experiences." This transatlantic description, referencing Rikers in New York and a cathedral in France, condenses sensations from disparate monuments, places, and moments that each inflect the subject of her paintings across time. Rather than paint a series, Mitchell used the diptych to introduce the sequencing of time, space, and transformation within a single composition. After a period of splitting her time between New York and Paris, moving from studio to studio each time she returned to France, Mitchell settled in Paris in 1959 with the French-Canadian painter Jean-Paul Riopelle. She leased a studio at 15 Rue Fremicourt, where she would remain until moving to La Tour, Auteuil the following decade. With a dedicated space to work after a period of constant movement and shipping rolled canvases back to New York, she embarked on a new suite of paintings anchored in France that featured in her first solo exhibitions in Europe. The title of the work at right, Cercando un Ago, Looking for the Needle, and the thick layers of dark blue, umber, red, and green and white marks heaped into a central mass offer a wry nod to Monet. These works were titled Cherchez l'aiguille, Look for the Needle in French, when they were grouped for Mitchell's Paris show at the Galerie Neufville, and later changed to Cercando un Ago, Looking for a Needle in Italian, for her solo exhibition in Milan shortly after. The humorous titles caught the eye of a French reviewer who noted the subtle reference to hay and the title and the vertical heaping compositions. Another noted the way, quote, the subjective tensions of the paintings is taken over along the way by the simplicity and objectivity of nature. Sunlight and earth tones invade the coils of psychic darkness. Declaring her place in France and the history of French art, the serial nature, interwoven composition, and title of these works nod openly to Monet's series of wheat stacks, often known as haystacks. Like Mitchell, Monet painted this series in a pivotal year, beginning in 1890, when he purchased his house at Giverny that he had rented since 1883, and would go on to transform into his celebrated gardens. In another parallel, Monet exhibited 15 of the 25 wheat stacks in an exhibition at Durand Ruel in 1891, the first time he had shown his works in this way. As one of Monet's most significant series, he noted in an 1890 letter, quote, I'm working away at a series of different effects of stacks, but at this time of year, the sun sets so quickly that I can't keep up. The further I go, the better I see that it takes a great deal of work to succeed in rendering what I want to render. Instantaneity, above all, shall envelop, the same light diffused over everything. In parallel fashion, Mitchell's solo exhibition also asserted her lasting presence of her work on the European scene. More than any visual similarity, this commitment to working most closely resembled Mitchell's own approach and investment in painting. With broad lines and deep hues of color, including blue and olive accented with flashes of red and white, this composition creates a richly layered surface where the ground, pale washes, and overlayers interweave to create a luminous effect. To make her paintings, Mitchell worked slowly to get a specific look. As she explained in 1957, quote, the freedom in my work is quite controlled. I don't close my eyes and hope for the best. I want to know what my brush is doing. Soon after these exhibitions, the concentrated central marks that appeared throughout Mitchell's 1950s works began to coalesce into more defined clusters of marks in the 1960s. Mitchell would continue in this direction, returning to the multi-panel format in the early 1960s as she and Riopelle spent summers sailing the Mediterranean, and she brought memories of watery vistas back to the studio. Throughout her career, Mitchell worked simultaneously on large-scale and intimately scaled canvases, often experimenting with scaling her gestural brush marks to different formats. As she developed the central forms of her 1960s works, she exhibited a small group of paintings, an example of which we see here, at Stable Gallery, New York, as, quote, 14 stations on Paris subway. As they are seen at right, Mitchell likely conceived of these works as a tightly focused group, seen here pinned in 2 neat rows on the wall of her Fremicourt studio. With dense central masses of marks, seen here in this work to your left, blue, teal, red, and purple, the artist used the brush and even fingers to build an impastoed tangle framed by just textured white edges. Recalling her longtime interest in painting urban and natural landscapes, The Paris subway reference quietly reflects Mitchell's own movements around Paris, from her studio to see friends or paintings at galleries and museums. While Monet is most known for his natural landscapes, he also painted a group of works capturing trains arriving at Gare Saint-Lazare in Paris in a period when he rented a Paris studio nearby at 17 Rue Montcy and commuted to his home in the suburb of Argenteuil. Monet ultimately created a group of 12 Saint-Lazare paintings, capturing the blue-gray smoke of arriving trains against the transparent glass ceiling of the station, creating a similar tension between city and nature, painting and light. In the years before Mitchell moved to Latour, references to 19th century painting and Monet periodically resurfaced in Mitchell's works, at times in obscure or cryptic ways. But shortly after, she purchased her Latour estate at Viteuil in 1967, even as she continued to paint in her Paris studio at Rue Firmicourt until 1968. Her first solo exhibition at Galerie Fournier in Paris in May 1967 announced more openly her engagement with landscape and its history in painting. The exhibition included works with titles such as Woods Country and Likely My Landscape 1, that it claimed nature as the tight central masses of her 1960s paintings unfurled into organic bulbs that evoke light bursting through a dense foliage. After weekend visits to Latour, Mitchell brought memories of her new landscape, seen here from the balcony, back to the studio. As she wrote to her New York dealer at Martha Jackson Gallery that year, "I have worked very hard, very slowly, lots of color and old-fashioned paint quality." Critics also took note. As one described, Mitchell persists, quote, "in a strictly personal direction, a perpetual voyage between expression and impression." Mitchell's new landscape was at once new and deeply familiar in memories of paintings that she had known at the Art Institute of Chicago, which included 2 compositions Monet painted of Viteuil seen here. These are 2 of among a series of 15 works that Monet made in the summer of 1901, shortly after he returned from his 3rd trip to London, as he struggled to complete his Waterloo and Charing Cross Bridge paintings. Monet rented a house in Lavacour, across the Seine from Viteuil. He painted the frame of his view from the balcony, with variable lights and atmospheric effects. These works depicted from afar a familiar sight where 2 decades earlier he himself had rented the cottage on the Latour property that would later become Mitchell's. Yet more than Monet's own history, Mitchell also closely identified Viteuil with memories of Chicago, associating the Seine with Lake Michigan that she could see from her childhood bedroom, and the landscape with remembered paintings. In listing her influences in 1973, she anchored her historical references to paintings she knew in Chicago, saying Van Gogh, Cézanne, Matisse, all of whom I saw at the Art Institute. While working in her studio at Latour, Mitchell's second exhibition at Galerie Fournier in 1969 featured works that reflected her surroundings, as well as her broader interest in 19th century painting beyond Monet. As Mitchell later explained of her first year at Latour, quote, "I remember starting the sunflowers, which I saw in Viteuil, and painted them in Firmicourt. And when I started painting in Viteuil, you can just take the stretched paintings out. Well, that really changed unconsciously an awful lot." The exhibition included a suite of sunflower paintings based on the towering mammoth Russian sunflowers that Riopelle, like Monet, planted at the property, and extended her engagement with 19th century painters, including Van Gogh. As she wrote in a letter to a friend, "Pick turned into a sunflower, apologies to Vincent." In contrast to the ordered structures of the traditional French gardens maintained at Latour by Jean Pertuis and his wife Raymonde, a cook and housekeeper, Riopelle had thrown the seeds at random on the lawn and also near Mitchell's studio. In these areas, the sunflowers grew freely to heights of 10 or 12 feet, which Mitchell compared to trees. You can see one of the towering sunflowers here with Mitchell. Alongside a group of works titled Sunflower, Mitchell also painted the grand-scaled 3-panel Untitled painting that we see here. This work introduced the thick layers of white and yellow dappled paint, almost directly magnifying impressionist brushwork on a large scale to capture atmospheric effects of light and natural motifs from petals, stems, and leaves. In contrast to the series that Monet favored, Mitchell introduced a sense of space, time, landscape, and transformation into a single composition through the multi-panel format. Here, a central bloom in the middle panel appears to droop and dissolve into a hazy white space on either side. Impastoed layers of yellows touched with thin washes of lavender, white, and light blues concentrate into central passages that echo her elevated views of the countryside. She noted a muted critical response to these paintings at the time, writing, "I have somehow made a distance between me and those art magazines." Yet one critic later called Mitchell, quote, "the last heir to the grand tradition," describing in her work a, quote, "purely abstract space is suddenly interrupted by a yellow literally taken from a sunflower." While Mitchell's earlier work drew from her travels, at Latour she began to draw from the transformations of the landscape that she observed from different vantage points and through the seasons. Following her suite of sunflower paintings, Mitchell turned her attention more closely to her patchwork view of the nearby houses, fields, and Seine that split around an island, which her gallerist Jean Fournier described as your river seen from the top of your garden coming out of your studio. As Mitchell explained, there's always, quote, "this three-part division of what you see. There's the ground right in front of you, that rooftop of Monet's with those tiles, and then the river." The gridded partitioning of the landscape informed what Mitchell called her, quote, fields and territories paintings of the 1970s, such as Plowed Field, that took from her stacked views of the countryside and remembered paintings. The monumental triptych we see here, and is on view in the exhibition nearby, balances a luminous surface of hazy blocks of earthy greens and golden yellows with atmospheric pinks, reds, and greens, and maroon and teal swatches. With an active surface of splatters, washes, and thick impastoed paint, the composition could recall the scale and airy brushwork of Monet's Nymphaeas, but also the touchstone of Van Gogh and his Wheat Field with Crows from 1890. As Mitchell explained, "I did those fields. It's a different space, but there's a field with a sky, and homage to Vincent, perhaps. There are no crows, but those fields where he did that is not far from where I live." Mitchell found new ways to paint her experience of the landscape, its history, and its transformations over the seasons, capturing fields and sky separated by constantly shifting reflections off of the Seine. As she explained in 1974, "I'm very old-fashioned. My paintings aren't about art issues, they're about a feeling." While the countryside outside Mitchell's studio remained central, her work inside the studio centered around painting and her own experiences and memories of walking through her gardens and the nearby fields and woods. Almost a decade into her time at Latour, the initial excitement around moving to the country waned, and Mitchell settled into a daily routine that revolved around her dogs, including her German Shepherd Eva, who we see here, as well as reading, listening to music, and walking through her landscape before going to the studio each night to paint. As she explained, quote, "music, poems, landscape, and dogs make me want to paint, and painting is what allows me to survive." No Rain is a work that Mitchell painted after a particularly dry summer in France. It shows a shift in direction from the airy views of her fields and territories paintings, instead repeating broad vertical brushstrokes that capture the density of grass, bushes, and beds of flowers. Mitchell's intimate knowledge of her landscape and its association with painting resurfaced in a letter to her New York dealer, Xavier Fourcade, after he visited in 1974. As Mitchell wrote, "Next time we can dine under the linden tree longer. The 3 trees in front are not cypress, only that skinny one. Still thinking of your Van Gogh hedge." These comparisons also emerged in Mitchell's paintings. Measuring over 12 feet wide, this diptych creates a tension between surface and depth that echoes a celebrated work by Van Gogh, Rain, a postcard of which hung in the artist's studio. Van Gogh painted this work, which we see at left, while staying at a clinic outside of Arles, where he could see a wheat field from his bedroom window. With a sharp perspective accented by a wall surrounding the field, Van Gogh created a jarring contrast with the surface, with a series of slashing diagonal lines in deep and bright blues and greens that seem to sit on the surface of the composition. In No Rain, Mitchell created a similar tension between surface and depth, even as she used little variation in the width of her brush and worked using almost exclusively vertical strokes and dappled marks. Mitchell selected No Rain for the cover of her first exhibition at Xavier Fourcade Gallery in New York in 1976, which announced this new direction. Critics notice the shift in perspective in these works, which, as one described, as if one were, quote, not observing nature, but pressing one's face into it. While No Rain extended almost fully to the edge of the canvas, other works from this period also turned to specific trees. Mitchell concentrated her repeated staccato brush marks into tangled compositions of trees from her property in paint, using contrasting colors, sharp brushwork, and dense central forms to capture their transformations over the seasons. These are two works from the exhibition nearby, and at left we see the sparse severity of red tree that echoes the dramatic pollarding or pruning of the trees on the property of Latour. Mitchell's series of tilleul paintings, which you see at right, reflect the imposing presence of a linden tree on her property. As Mitchell explained in 1976, this is a tree, I mean my idea of a tree, which has nothing to do with a real tree, except to me it has to do with a real tree. To copy a real tree would be absolutely impossible. As she continued, I can't quote Van Gogh, but it's in one of his so many beautiful letters where he says he gives gratitude to the sunflower because it exists. And I give gratitude to trees because they exist. And that's all my painting is about. As seen in this photograph, a massive linden tree near the front door of Mitchell's home was an everyday fixture of her view. As she walked to the studio, she saw a row of smaller tilleuls out front. The dense, concentrated summer foliage, bare winter branches infused a suite of tilleul pastels and paintings that Mitchell revisited in the studio. As Mitchell mentioned in her 1976 interview, her paintings did not copy or represent a tree, but drew from memories of recent and distant experiences that fueled her painting. While skylights allowed natural light from above, Mitchell covered her windows, often working on one or two panels of a painting at a time. Instead of looking out to the landscape while she worked, she turned to painting, memories, and feeling to direct her compositions. As she explained, quote, painting is a way of forgetting oneself. I call that state no hands. I'm in it, I'm not there anymore. On a wall of Mitchell's studio featured postcards of works by Van Gogh, including Rain, which you see in the center, Franz Klein, Cézanne, and others, among reproductions of Mitchell's own works for invitations or openings. Whether sent by friends or pinned up alongside a strip of comics, these images and visual anchors in friends, peers, and predecessors were each framed by her own roots in 19th century painting. In her final decade, Mitchell's long interest and deep knowledge and familiarity with 19th century painting emerged most openly as Mitchell confronted works by Van Gogh and Cézanne with her own renewed intensity. This ambitious canvas was painted the year before Mitchell held a traveling solo exhibition that debuted at the Herbert F. Johnson Museum of Art in Ithaca, New York. Across two panels, tangles of broad brushstrokes coalesce into a clear landscape composition, marked by horizontal greens above, yellows, browns, and pinks and blues below. While Mitchell often worked on separate panels at a time, at times leaving no connecting marks between them, select green lines and daubs of yellow bridge these two panels. With the title No Birds, the composition and structure of this work respond almost directly to Van Gogh's Wheatfield with Crows, a touchstone work Mitchell had recently seen in New York at a Van Gogh exhibition at the Metropolitan Museum of Art. Mitchell drew from the concentration of brushwork, color, and proportion of Van Gogh's landscape, but also the centripetal anchor of the diagonal path that cuts through the center. In Mitchell's diptych, a concentration of yellowed angled marks across the dividing line of the two panels achieves a similar effect on a large scale. Wheatfield would remain a lasting point of reference for the artist. In a 1991 interview, Mitchell used similar terms to describe a pastel drawing, seemingly overlaying Van Gogh's work with her own, as she described, quote, there's a little Van Gogh over there, blue sky and green grass, no birds. 2 years later, Mitchell similarly took another anchor in the work of Paul Cézanne in this work, South, also in view in the exhibition. Mitchell painted this diptych, translating Cézanne's numerous paintings and studies of Mont Sainte-Victoire into a single work. The two panels feature towering heaps of marks in luminous colors that reflect the blazing light of the south of France. With touches of white paint over underlayers, the artist created a masking effect to isolate two mountainous forms marked by red X's that seemed to declare Mitchell's own presence in the composition. Rather than reference a singular work, South draws from a body of remembered paintings seen together or across oceans and time. As Mitchell explained in a 1992 interview, you can't enter a Cézanne because it pushes you back. The eyes push back to the surface right away. That's why I love it. Here, Cézanne at first appears to create a sense of depth and perspective between the green trees in the foreground and the distant mountain. Yet in the central area, it appears that the painting is pushing towards the surface of the canvas with the block-like forms that the artist called passage. Mitchell achieves a similar visual tension rooted in the landscapes known through memories of travels and paintings. While the use of white and red X marks push the composition to the surface, a central passage of green and blue remains largely clear of red, marked more subtly by blue crosses. Here, only two streaking horizontal red marks make a final connection between the two panels, merging landscape, painting, and memory with the final sweep of the brush. Almost 40 years earlier, while in the Lavandou in the south of France in 1948, Mitchell had similarly collapsed her experiences of landscapes with those known through paintings. As she wrote, quote, "The South, Arles, looks just like Van Gogh and Aix like Cézanne, and this place like nobody. I eat lunch on the terrace in the sun and I paint all day. It's like no place, no country." As Mitchell confronted her own mortality in her final years, the landscape at Latour evoked recent and distant memories of seasons, friends, places, and paintings that resurfaced in her paintings. As she traveled less frequently, Mitchell's gardens and plants became central to her last paintings. Made in the final year of her life, as she struggled with declining health and limited mobility, Ici, which is in the collection here, attests to Mitchell's full commitment to, quote, continual working. She persisted in making large-scale paintings with alternating lush and achingly spare compositions. In these years, Mitchell described the solace of her studio, explaining, quote, "The solitude that I find in my studio is one of plenitude. I am enough for myself. I live fully there." Titled Ici, or Here in French, this diptych brims with plenitude and presence in time and place. Central yellow, green, and orange bulbs, a form that Mitchell often associated with sunflowers, are surrounded by contrasting blue, maroon, and lavender marks. With bold strokes connecting across the panels, the artist's use of thick and thin brushes, broad sweeping gestures, and staccato marks shows her full control developed over decades of working. Looking at once out, inward, backward, and forwards to landscape, painting, and her own body of work and remembered works from the 19th century, Ici makes a final declaration of presence, marking Mitchell's place in the history of painting the same year she died. Thank you very much.
There we go. If anyone, thank you very much, Maren. And if anyone has a question, we'll be walking around with a microphone. So just raise your hand, please. I've got one way back here. What do you think Joan Mitchell would think about the show?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think because she lived at Monet's property, her association or interest in having her name associated with Monet became much more distant in later years, I would say. So, earlier on, I think she more openly acknowledged Monet as one of the 19th century painters she was interested in. But after outside critics continually made the association in the 1960s, after she lived at the same property as Monet on Avenue Claude Monet, she became a little bit frustrated, I think, and would often go against it. But I think the show nicely shows a dialogue between and shows her kind of the way she's looking back to other artists.
Great presentation. I was wondering, and so was my daughter, if Joan Mitchell had any interest or involvement in the civil rights movement and the Black freedom struggle?
That's a great question. Thank you for asking. In the 60s, because Mitchell had moved to Paris and then out to the countryside in Vitoy, I think she was a little bit less connected to the movements happening in the United States. So in those period, I think she's a little bit less engaged with politics. But yeah, that's a great question.
Anyone else? Don't be shy. Okay. All right. Well, wonderful. Thank you very much, Marin.